Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga Night 60s. Well, I read a really fascinating article last week about squandering our resource wealth, written by Jack Mintz. And so I wanted to check in with Mr. Mintz to find out, what's his argument all about. Jack Mintz is a President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Welcome to our show, sir. How are you?
Very good. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So tell us, why do you think Canada is squandering our resource wealth?
Well, I think it's kind of a bit obvious in many ways. Right now, we do have actually more production of oil and gas than ever. But what's happened is that we are no longer seeing much investment taking place in the industry. And we do face the risk of not being able to sell more oil and gas that can be profitably done at this time. While at the same time, the industry is making significant headway in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, more so than many state-owned enterprises around the world that are selling oil and gas. And we are actually potentially undermining our ability to actually contribute to reducing GHG emissions at the international level by not replacing some of the production that's taking place in oil and coal abroad, where we could be offering particularly LNG, but also cleaner oil down the road than what's available in some places.
So what do you think we should be doing?
Well, I think we should, first of all, have a federal government that's willing to signal that that more oil can be developed in Canada and not try to block pipelines and other things that have not allowed for production to take place or more development to take place. And particularly the federal government's regulatory stance has been to basically try to reduce oil and gas development and basically halt it, which has been done. And also some of the provinces, particularly Quebec, has natural gas that could be developed and sold as LNG to the rest of the world. This would give immense wealth to Quebec, allowing it to even potentially reduce the amount of equalization payments that it needs, but it also, more importantly, would give incomes to Quebecers and reduce some of the taxes that they have to pay for their goods and their public services that they get from the government. But Quebec has blocked any development of natural gas that could actually facilitate LNG that could be sold to Europe. And of course, we have another issue these days, and that is world security and the alliance that we have around the world that has a great opportunity to use Canadian LNG particularly to replace Russian natural gas, which of course could significantly help Ukraine and the security of Europe at the same time. So we have a role to help the rest of the world, both in security and in environmental for environmental reasons, while at the same time providing reliable and cheap oil and gas available for other parts of the world.
And we're not doing it. And it just doesn't make sense to me. And I wonder why. The Chancellor of Germany was recently in our country, and when asked, the Prime Minister said that there wasn't a business case to ship LNG to the east coast of Canada. Why is that?
Well, I don't know why is that. I mean, I think that I was just at a conference last week in Banff, and of course this was the Energy Executive the Canadian Energy Executive Forum Association, and it's a forum they have once a year. And I can tell you there were a lot of people just absolutely puzzled by the Prime Minister's comment about there's a lack of a business case. It may be that there are a number of projects that have been proposed in the past that can't be delivered because it's not economic, and that's quite possible. I know that there are some. But there have been a number of projects that have been proposed that I know could have made it had there been a more, let's say, positive signal given by the federal government about its development. But the federal government is so concerned about GHG emissions in Canada that it doesn't think about GHG emissions from in terms of the world. And we have to remember that global warming is an international issue. We'll only be able to deal with global warming if we have a reduction in worldwide emissions. Canadian emissions may go up with LNG, but on the other hand, if that contributes to replacing coal and other types of high emissions, then that, I think, that can end up being a benefit in terms of reducing GHG emissions. And so our goal should be to do what we can as a country to reduce worldwide GHG emissions and be less concerned about our actual total amount versus what we do to contribute to less amount around the world.
A major oil industry executive was interviewed after that comment about there not being a business case, and he said the only issue in the business case is uncertainty about the regulatory approval process. Everything else actually makes a lot of business sense. So it's just the regulatory approval that is a question. Is that?
That's right. And yes, it's Bill C-69 that has developed this impact assessment approach, and it has made it very uncertain about how we can get LNG produced. Now, I think another side of it has been in the past, and I fault this to the industry, frankly, that they could have perhaps done more to try to get some of the Aboriginal groups or the Indigenous groups involved with projects. But these days, the Indigenous groups are very interested in their own economic vitality, and have been, a number of them have actually been getting involved with resource development. And I think they understand very well the benefits that are associated with it. But certainly it's very important for the industry to do the consultation with the Indigenous groups, which I think is quite possible. And we have to remember there's hundreds of these Indigenous groups. Even TMX, the pipeline that was being built in British Columbia had 120 First Nations.
120.
120, and there were 5 or 6, particularly near Burnaby, BC, that were opposed to the plan, but quite a few others had signed up. And so we have to remember that there's not a single voice amongst the Indigenous groups at all.
We're chatting with Jack Mintz tonight about LNG, about resources that Canada has that we should be shipping around the world, and reducing climate change and reducing worldwide dependence on Russian oil. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Jack Mintz. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Jack Mintz. We're talking about an article that he penned in the Financial Post last week called "Squandering Our Resource Wealth," where he argues that Canada should be doing more, and we should be doing more for the security, international security, particularly in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Russia. Some people think using really energy terrorism to force more adherence in Eastern Europe and in Germany to what Russia wants. But then also that because of that and other moves, Germany, other countries are moving to use either coal and or Russian natural gas that is more negative from a carbon standpoint, from a climate change standpoint, than if we were using Canadian natural gas. I want to introduce you a little bit to our guest, Jack Mintz, if I could. He is the chair of public policy, the Palmer Chair of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He was a professor for 18 years at the University of Toronto. He was for 6 years the president and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute. He was a professor for 11 years at Queen's University. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Essex, an MA in economics from Queen's University, and a BA in economics from the University of Alberta. So Dr. Mintz, I should say, is an extremely well-educated gentleman. You know, I got to ask you, spending such a long time in Calgary, Toronto, and Kingston, you really bridge the gaps between Eastern Canada, Central Canada, and the prairies, Alberta. Is there this big divide in Canada today that people talk about? Fear of Alberta separation and Albertans that think that they're getting the short end of the stick from Ottawa?
Well, I think there is a danger all the time of having a breakdown. I mean, we have to remember people move across Canada. In fact, I was born and raised in Edmonton, and I went to the University of Alberta for my undergraduate degree before going on, and actually have lived most of my life in Eastern Canada, which actually Albertans think of Ontario and Quebec as Eastern Canada as well as the Atlantic. Well, if you're living here, you think of Eastern Canada as being just the Atlantic. But we do have a lot of similarities, and I think breaking up is not that easy, with the kind of fact that many of us have friends and family that live right across the country, and so we are part of a major country. But I've written about this in the past. There are two types of conflicts that occur in federal countries. One of them is what you might think of as differences in tastes. For example, one part of a country coming from, having very different culture or very different language, or very different priorities, as in a sense. But particularly, we can think of, for example, countries that have had a great deal of pressure and actually broke up. A good example is Malaysia and Singapore, where Singapore was Chinese, dominated by Chinese community. Singapore, by the Bhumipatra, there was a breakup between the two of them, where Singapore wanted to get its more autonomy in making its own decisions, and there really was a very different culture between the two. Same thing has happened in other parts of the world where you've had breakups in countries. But there's another example where you can get a breakup, and that is when you have a richer part of the country that is looked upon to subsidize everybody else. But in order to subsidize everybody else, you have to take a lot of money per capita from the small country, from the small part of the region, in order to subsidize everyone else, and that's which has a much bigger population, and that's a very good example of that kind of problem that has occurred in Spain, for example, between the eastern part of Spain, which has been particularly Barcelona and that area, which has resented the regional development programs that they were paying for to subsidize other parts of Spain, and of course that has led to some unhappiness in Spain, which in fact they even voted for an independence at one point, and which has not happened. The Spanish government wouldn't allow it, but it did create a great deal of disagreement. In Canada, we really have both of those operating. One is Quebec, which I think of as differences in tastes from the rest of the country. They have their own culture and their own sense of priority. And then you have Alberta, which is a smaller, rich region, which has contributed over $600 billion. In fact, it's probably now close to $700 billion to the rest of Canada since 1960. And this isn't just equalization, it's just through the federal budget. The federal Albertans have paid more taxes than they receive back in federal spending. And then with the National Energy Program back in the early 80s, that was a huge transfer program where the price of oil in Canada was kept below the international price by putting a large export tax on Alberta sales to the rest of the world. And that money was used to pay for subsidies for consumers, which of course that was particularly a benefit to Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic. And Albertans really resented that National Energy Program. And now, since the past 10 years, particularly since 2015, when the Liberals got elected and brought in Bill C-69, the tanker ban that basically made it very difficult for a pipeline to be built in northern BC, and the regulatory system today, which makes it very difficult to build not only pipelines, which is the constitutional power of the federal government, but is also stopping production or new plants being developed in Alberta and Saskatchewan for oil, because they need federal approval with respect to GHG emissions. And so there's a huge conflict here right now, and there is a great deal of resentment in Alberta that. But the debate in Alberta is whether it's a matter of seeking autonomy. I don't think right now Albertans are in favor of separatism, but polls have shown that there's about 30% of Albertans that would be interested in the separatist option. And I think only if it was the final straw that would have to be drawn.
While 30% may be less than 50%, it's a sizable plurality. And my understanding is that the leading candidate for the UCP candidacy for leader right now is very supportive of separation, if in fact not almost de facto separation, with some of her policies that would give Alberta rights to lots of things even before any kind of referendum might be held or separation would be held.
Well, I think Danielle Smith, who's the leader, who is the person that has been leading the UCP race at this point. Whether she wins or not, we'll see. But she had started off proposing what's called the Sovereignty Act. And I don't think she would say that she's interested in separation at this point. But the Sovereignty Act, which she said would be simply using the powers under the current Constitution Act, or what we used to refer to as the British North America Act. She said that, anything that would violate those constitutional rights, the Alberta legislature could pass legislation to say that we're not going to implement federal powers in the province. And to get her examples have been things like restrictions, public health restrictions, such as the ones during COVID, and also things there that, to give you an example, there's right now a project in Alberta called Coal Spur that the Alberta regulator has approved, but the federal government won't approve it, and yet it's simply a coal project that I think it's metallurgical coal, so it's not the same as thermal coal, but it's a coal project that has satisfied all the environmental issues, but the federal government has not been willing to do it, and that raises an interesting question: to what extent can the federal government, with its shared responsibility over environment with Alberta, has the constitutional power? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to answer that question. But it seems to me that this is a very good example where I think the solution to a lot of these issues would be the federal government and the province working out an agreement on a joint agreement on environmental issues, that perhaps the province would make some promises about how it would reduce emissions over time, and then carry out the policies that get to that point. Right now, we're having unilateral action being taken by the province, by the federal government, and I think that's creating a lot of hostility in Alberta, and will continue to do so unless that changes.
There's obviously a lot of people in central Canada that are very worried about climate change and worried about greenhouse gases, and there's been this attitude that Alberta and oil and gas production is the problem. But I was out in Fort McMurray last fall, and I met with several different oil executives. I came to Edmonton and Calgary and did the same thing. And most of them were very cognizant of the need to address climate change. None of them that I met with, at least publicly with me, stated anything close to being a climate change denier. In fact, all of them were saying that we had to do things, whether it be carbon sequestering or hydrogen. And there were a lot of people at the time, this was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so oil prices were still low, talking about hydrogen as being potentially something that was the future for the oil sands north of Edmonton. So there was a fair amount of attention to. People were lamenting that money was being spent on share buybacks and on technological improvements to the production of oil and gas to remove carbon from it, rather than expansion. But they didn't think at the time, given low oil prices, that there was any need for expansion. So it almost seemed like there wasn't such a difference between attitudes in the East and the West when oil prices were low. But that difference seems to have expanded dramatically in the last couple of months as oil prices have gone up, primarily, I think, because of obviously international tensions in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Well, I think we have to, I do agree with you that the change, there's been a very significant change in the past 6 months with respect to how we think about oil and gas. I mean, it's first of all, we have to remember that oil and gas is responsible for something like 25–30% of emissions in Canada. It's not responsible for all emissions. And so, there's also emissions that we have with automobiles, and we could have no oil and gas production in Canada, but we would be importing oil and gas for industrial purposes, and for transportation purposes, cement, and all sorts of other things that we do. If we didn't have an oil and gas sector, we'd just be a lot poorer as a country. So that's one thing to remember. The other issue is on the security issue. It's completely changed, I think, the way that people are thinking about these things, because we have to remember that the high oil and gas prices are leading to very significant increases in power prices in Europe. And the green policies that Europe has had, where they thought they could just simply rely on wind and solar, may be something that may be possible 30 years from now if we get electrical storage, which right now is neither technically or commercially feasible at this point, to the extent that we would need it. And that's part of the problem, is that when you actually look at how we can get to net zero, which I think, by the way, I totally agree with you. Albertans basically believe the same thing as the rest of Canada, and the industry believes it as well. But it's a question of the pace and how you get there. And just simply saying we're going to have a target like 2030, reducing by 42% oil and gas emissions. The only way you can do that, because of the technology that's now available and can be put in place, like carbon capture and storage over the next 8 years, the only way you can do that is to cut production. And that would actually undermine the wealth of the country. It's actually, we forget that actually oil and gas is our biggest export as a country. It's more important than the automobile industry. And we could see a very significant decline in the Canadian dollar and the problems that are associated with that. So, I think people are now starting to realize that we have a contribution as a country to make towards world peace, and we have a contribution to make towards environment, and we also have to have a realistic path of getting to net zero. And I think the question is, what's that realistic path? I don't think we know that yet, and I don't think the federal government has a clue what that path is.
So right now, it would appear that the only solution is to ship our natural gas to the Americans and have them potentially either liquefy it or just replace natural gas that they would otherwise be, using. And their natural gas is going to be the natural gas that's liquefied and shipped to Europe. So we're not really contributing to Germany's problem at all, are we?
Well, perhaps indirectly through some of the natural gas that we provide to the United States. But we have to remember that the U.S. has been very busy building LNG plants. In fact, they have 3 of them now under construction on top of if I remember, 6 export terminals that they currently have. And we also see Australia doing the same thing too. So they have been able to help the rest of the world with some LNG. While we have not built one LNG export terminal yet as a country, and we've been talking about that for 15 years. We're finally getting one built, which will be the one in British Columbia on the West Coast, LNG Canada, which is a fairly large one. It'll be about 14 million tons per year of LNG that it will ship to Asia. But that's finally going to get operational, I understand, by 2025. But it's taken a long time. That thing has been proposed for over a decade. And we've had other projects that have been proposed, like the Petronas one. I know that there's Exxon had another one that they were looking at, but the climate to build LNG just wasn't there with the kind of hostility that the federal government had towards LNG after 2015.
And the LNG that the United States is producing, I understand some of it, if not a lot of it, comes from shale coal. It's a byproduct of shale. Is that not the case?
I thought it was shale natural gas, but it is in coal seams that you can get the shale gas that can be used for LNG.
And so some people claim that the natural gas that we produce is far cleaner than the natural gas that is produced in the United States, and so therefore, allowing the excess production of natural gas in the United States is actually versus Canada is actually harmful to the overall climate change issue. Yeah,
I'm personally less knowledgeable about that, so I'm not going to say yes or no to that.
Okay.
But I do know that we also talk about green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen would come from natural gas where you use carbon capture and sequestration to separate out carbon, and then you could use it to produce what's called blue hydrogen. Another approach, of course, is green hydrogen, where you take electrolysis energy to break up water to produce hydrogen. That's the one that Newfoundland is building on the agreement with Germany. But there's I've read actually some things about green hydrogen. It's not all pretty. I mean, there's very significant emissions associated with the energy used just to break up water so that you could get hydrogen, and it's very energy intensive. And so there are emissions associated with it. And so your net contribution to reduction of emissions isn't necessarily as strong as you would like it to be.
Well, and you need to get the electricity. You need to produce the electricity. And how are you going to produce the electricity to start with?
Well, that's exactly right. And, people hope that it's going to be wind and solar to do that. And that's possible up to a certain degree. But as we also know that there's no way right now that we can replace the over 80, it's roughly 80% of our electrical consumption is with fossil fuel production across the world. That's coal, oil, and natural gas. And if we try to replace all of it with solar and wind, it just would take up way too much land. It's very intensive. It could also become very expensive over time. And so we're probably going to need a balance of many things in order to replace fossil fuels. And that will include nuclear. It will include carbon capture and storage to make hydrogen and all sorts of other things. And every forecast I've seen, whether it's the International Energy Association, the Stanford Modeling Group, basically there is no way that we can produce all the energy that we need with solar and wind alone.
We're chatting with Jack Mintz tonight. He has written an interesting article about Canada squandering our resource wealth, particularly as it relates to our inability to get our act together and ship LNG to Germany. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Professor Mintz. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dr. Jack Mintz. He is head of an organization at Calgary, the President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He has been a professor at the University of Calgary, at the University of Toronto, at the Queen's University. He's been president and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute. Obviously, a well-educated gentleman, someone that has been a student of Canadian politics, of Canadian economics. Just going through his social media, he writes about once a month, or even more often than once a month, in a major Canadian publication. So it's an interesting background that you have, sir, and thank you for your contribution to Canadian public policy. I appreciate it. one of the ironic things about this situation is that, the biggest reduction in greenhouse gases in Canadian history, I understand, was in Ontario by closing down coal-fired plants, but that was replaced by nuclear power. And one of the problems that we've got in Germany, or Germany has in Germany, is that they've closed down their nuclear plants and replaced their nuclear and coal plants with gas from Russia, and they're not willing to reopen their nuclear power plants. And so, we're reliant on nuclear power in Ontario and in Canada, and yet Germany is in the problem they're in because they closed down nuclear, they closed down coal, and they're unwilling to reopen nuclear, but they actually are thinking about reopening some coal plants. So that's a little bit of an ironic twist to this whole situation. Obviously, the climate change individuals in Germany have not been as successful as the anti-nuclear activists in Germany. In your article, you're pretty hard-hitting. Let me quote, if I could, just a little bit. "We must be living on another planet. We must be living on another planet. Other countries need our oil and gas, even as we shift to new technologies, some of which are neither feasible or commercial yet. We will add billions to our wealth if we could sell LNG and more oil to the rest of the world. Yet we shut down our oil and gas exports while our oil and gas producing allies, the US and Australia, for example, move ahead." Sounds like you're pretty negative on our Canadian government strategy and think the United States and Australia have a far better strategy.
Oh, I'm not sure about the US. Certainly Australia has had a far better strategy. So has Norway, by the way. I mean, Norway has gone further in reducing emissions, but at the same time, they've encouraged oil and gas development coming out of Norway. In fact, they get a lot of revenue from it, and so they depend highly on it. And we're in that same position too. It's a very significant source of wealth for Canada. The other thing we have to remember is that these high oil and gas prices are really hurting a lot of families in Europe, but also in North America. And that's the reason why even the United States, which has been very the Democrat government, the Biden administration has been really trying to do very similar things as Canada in not allowing new leases and more development of oil and gas in the United States. At the same time, with these high oil prices, they've had to do certain things, such as opening up certain opportunities that they wouldn't have had, they wouldn't have allowed. And of course, they've now brought in a bill that is going to provide huge subsidies for carbon capture and sequestration and other technologies, including nuclear technology. In fact, they are so significant that we're not even competitive right now for production or for the development of these new clean energy developments if we stay where we're at. And so we're now not only going to be not able to compete in oil and gas, but we're not even going to be able to compete in clean energy if we don't think of a better approach in terms of what we're doing in terms of our overall energy sector, which has been so important to the Canadian economy and to the wealth of Canadians.
One of the first things that the Biden administration did is stop some pipelines that were to come from Canada. Some people think that, particularly given what happened in Ukraine with oil prices, that our government should have been going to the Biden administration and requesting/demanding that they change course on that pipeline decision. That hasn't happened either, has it?
No, in fact, we made some protests, but not very much. The only time when the Canadian government got really concerned was over Line 5, Enbridge's Line 5, which Michigan wants to close down. Why? Because that would be devastating to Ontario and Ontario voters if all of a sudden oil couldn't be shipped through, through Michigan into Ontario for the refineries in Ontario and the gasoline market in Toronto. There, the federal government has really taken strong action, and good for them for doing it. But it's only because they were worried about Ontario voters. They couldn't give two hoots about Alberta voters.
So you think the Ottawa government only cares about Ontario voters and couldn't give two hoots about Alberta voters?
Exactly.
That's pretty frank statement. Okay, so if we were going to build an ING plant right now on the east coast of Canada, how long would it take? LNG, I apologize.
It would take a few years. There's no question about that. But we're this issue of of international security and the need for natural gas is going to be there for some time. I just want to make one small point, and that is actually natural gas was actually used by Ontario as to replace coal as well. They kept the nuclear plants going, of course, in Ontario, but natural gas was the filler for coal, and that helped bring emissions down in Ontario. It's also helped bring emissions down in the United States. It wouldn't have happened without natural gas replacing coal in the United States. The same thing I think we need to think of over the next several years, that natural gas is going to be still important for industrial purposes, for heating people's homes, et cetera, and it's going to be needed worldwide. And it's a cleaner energy source than oil and coal, which is why some countries do like it, and that's why LNG is going to be very practical. So even if it takes 3 years for a plant to be built, there's still going to be a real need for natural gas. And right now, there's not much investment that's taking place worldwide in oil and gas, and especially in North America and Europe. And as a result, there's going to be shortages that are going to be throughout this decade. This is not the end of the story. Just in the next 2 years, even if there's some resolution that comes to the conflict that's occurred with Russia and Ukraine. Well, I should say the unfair invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
So, you say it's going to take minimum of 3 years. Some people think even more to build an LNG plant.
Depends on the size of the plant.
Just last year, oil prices were what, a third of where they are today. And 2 years ago, they were at some point in time, oil prices were actually negative, which is absurd. You're the economist. Maybe you can explain to me how oil prices were actually negative, which I don't think anyone understood, even a lot of economists. But do you really think they're going to stay high enough, long enough to justify the construction of a several billion-dollar plant on the east coast of Canada that's not going to be open for 3 or more years?
Yes, I think it could, because the way LNG works is through long-term contracts. So right now we have to remember, forget about Europe. The price of natural gas is right through the roof right now, and so it's it's way above what you'd find in Japan or Korea or China, for example, which is more like $18 per million cubic foot, or roughly around that. And so there is, assuming that would be the more normal price that you would see natural gas on long-term contracts, that would be highly profitable for LNG over the next several years to be built. And no one will undertake an LNG construction unless they have long-term contracts with consumers. That's just the way the business operates.
So given this situation where the Liberal government in Ottawa is not willing to go through the regulatory process, establish a positive business plan, what do you think should happen? Is this something that we just got to wait until there's a change in government? Is there something that the oil and gas industry could and should do? Is there something that the public should be doing? What do you think's the solution?
Well, I think it's really very much up to the public. Politicians respond to voters, and the voters feel very strongly that that we need to help Europe. We need to do more in terms of helping the rest of the world. And actually, energy is going to be, whether it's clean energy or traditional energy, it's still going to be needed for the rest of the world. And I think the public really has to start thinking a little bit more about what we can do in terms of helping the rest of the world, and not just think about in terms of what our own particular debates or political debates are going to be. And I think we have to remember, I think almost all Canadians, I think, would agree that we have to have a strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But that doesn't mean that we have to have no oil and gas. There could be oil and gas, which is going to be going through a transformation into the use of hydrogen or carbon fibers. There's all sorts of other things. We're still going to need plastics. We're still going to need asphalt. And so there's an important role of oil with respect to all those things. But it's not just for Canadian consumption. It's also for world consumption. And, you know, Canada has kind of lost its place in the world in the past number of years. We're not as prominent as we can be in terms of what we do in terms of helping security in the rest of the world. But energy could be part of that security equation, where through the production of reliable and cheap energy with low emissions, that could be a huge contribution that Canada makes to the rest of the world, including the technologies that we develop here.
Well, I think you put forward a fascinating critique of what's going wrong right now in energy policy, and a great challenge to our governments to get their act together. And I do think that right now, with what's happening in Ukraine, there's probably the best, not excuse, but rationale for why we need to do exactly what you're talking about, which is get our energy to markets in long-term contracts. And natural gas, liquefied natural gas, is far less impactful from a climate change standpoint than a lot of the alternatives. And so therefore that would appear to be the solution, while solar and wind and hydrogen or ammonia or other solutions may be long-term solutions. They're not the solutions right now. And I commend you in your efforts. We're going to take a break for 2 minutes and be back with some concluding comments from Professor Jack Mintz. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dr. Jack Mintz. He is head of one of the University of Calgary's programs. He is the President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He's been a professor at the University of Toronto, a professor at Queen's University. He's got degrees in economics from 3 or 4 different institutions around the world, and he's a prolific writer of columns. One of the columns, sir, that you wrote was about Sunrise Conservatives. I guess you attended their conference a couple of weeks ago, and you quoted Shakespeare and Macbeth in your reference to Pierre Poilievre's spirit hanging over the Sunrise Conservatives like a ghost. And in your column, you write numerous negative things about our economic statistics and progress in the last couple of years. You quote that we've had in the last decade, our worst growth in per capita GDP in over 75 years, that investment is lagging, that we're losing competitiveness, especially due to our regulatory and tax policies. What do you think the solution is, sir?
Well, I think we need to develop a better balance, I think, between policies that, where we redistribute income in order to help the vulnerable in society, which I think is important. But at the same time, we need policies that are going to encourage growth. And so I think a lot of Canadians are centrist. I think we tend to be fiscally responsible because we don't like running large deficits or putting ourselves into significant in a potential financial crisis because of bad decision making by governments on the fiscal side. But at the same time, I think a lot of us are not socially conservative, or we also do care about helping those Canadians that have difficulty. So it's a balancing act that's required. But I think what we've seen in the past while has been too much on the redistributive side and not thinking enough about how to get more growth. And it is true. I mean, if you look at per capita economic growth, and I've published a piece showing this from, I think from 1960, but doing it every 5 years. The last 5 years has been the worst that we've ever had in terms of per capita economic growth. And that's going to be a real problem because we don't have population growth that's more than 1%. In fact, most of it is done through immigration, and we're relying on bringing in people in order to grow the population. But if we don't have productivity growth, then we're not going to have enough taxes and revenues to cover all the social policies we would like to pay for. And so it's a spiral that you can get into, and I've seen countries get into. I used to do a lot of advice with the World Bank and the IMF around the world, and in fact, to give you a good example, I did quite a bit of work in Bulgaria on tax reform back in the late 1980s, but they got themselves into a huge amount of trouble, ran huge deficits. International lenders no longer wanted to give them money anymore. The government was in absolute crisis. The Bulgarian lev had devaluated tremendously by 1997. The country was in really serious trouble, but they got their act together. They undertook a whole bunch of reforms, including stabilizing their currency with the European Union, euro. They also undertook significant tax reform to encourage investment, to get away from some of the politically favored type investments that, policies that they had, to help certain industries but not others, which they taxed very highly. They undertook major reforms of pensions and other things. And it's amazing how the country actually turned around over the next 5-10 years because of much better economic policy. And I think in Canada, we have to worry about that now. We're on the wrong track, I think, in terms of having large deficits that have now led to high inflation. We have weak productivity growth. We have even immigration actually is now down compared to what it used to be, even though we may want to bring in 400,000 people a year, but we're not bringing in that right now. And we probably will. We're actually pretty good on the immigration side. But the main point is that we have to really seriously worry about getting growth back onto the political agenda, and not think that the future generations are going to pick up the tab for all the spending that governments want to push right now. And I think the public is getting more aware of that. And I'm hoping that there's going to be a change in attitude amongst voters to bring back the kind of centrist type, let's say, policies that we've had as a country under both, at the federal level, under both liberals and conservatives, but under, when you even look across the provinces, whether it's NDP government or a liberal or a conservative government in a province, they tend to be relatively centrish, maybe center right or center left, but we have not had really extreme cases, and when they are extreme, those governments don't last very long.
Do you think that's actually going to happen, though? It looks like the UCP in Alberta may be led by a very right-wing individual. We've talked about that already. It looks like the Conservative Party of Canada might be the leadership won by a very right-wing individual that some people are worried is a populist like Trump. And at the same time, the Liberals are in a effective coalition government with the NDP federally.
Well, actually, I kind of disagree with you on both those cases. I mean, I know Pierre Poilievre very well, and he is what I would call center right. In fact, if you read his platform, a lot of it is on reestablishing fiscal prudence in Canada, and he's certainly not a Trump type. I think all that is just press making what they want to say. What his real key point is he's arguing is freedom, for people having more freedom and less regulation in government, by governments and things like that, which was similar to some of the stances taken, whether it was in Europe with Margaret Thatcher or now with probably Liz Truss, who's the new leader in the British government. But I wouldn't. But if you actually read the actual proposals, I'm sure you would find them actually fairly reasonable in terms of their approach. Things like he wants to introduce something that the Americans have used both in the Clinton years and even in later in the Obama years, pay as you go, where if you end up spending, if a government wants to spend more money, they have to find money by cutting spending elsewhere.
Right.
And that's not an unreasonable approach to use. Now,
So I shouldn't focus on his firing of the governor of the Bank of Canada and his call for cryptocurrency as a hedge on inflation.
Well, no, you see, even there, I would disagree with. First of all, I think you're finding it across the world now. There's central bankers have taken a real hit for their policies from 2020 on, especially 2021, where they were very slow to react to inflationary pressures. And this has happened in the United States. There is a lot of criticism of the Federal Reserve now for what they did in 2021, and now they admit that they made a mistake. That's happened in Canada. And in fact, where I really disagree with the way that people have interpreted what Poilievre said is that his real argument is on competence. It's not on disagreement over monetary policy. We have to remember when the Liberals came into power in 1993 under the Chrétien government, which I thought was a very good government, but they didn't want to renew John Crow, who really pushed inflation targeting and did actually get inflation down to 2% that we've benefited since the early 90s from. But there was a lot of concern over continuing that type of monetary policy within the government at that point. And that's why they didn't want to renew them. And so, all I'm saying is that Poilievre's position, I think, on monetary policy is really saying that Bank of Canada had a role of controlling inflation and they flubbed it. And if somebody doesn't carry out the job properly, maybe they deserve to get fired.
Well, we're going to have to invite you back, sir, to hear more about your feelings about his policies, because there's a good chance in a week he's going to be leader of the Conservative Party. And I'd love to chat further about your issues on Canadian competitiveness and productivity. Anyway, that's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Professor Dr. Jack Mintz, thank you so much for joining us and telling us about what we need to do with our natural resources in Canada and not squander them. Good night, everybody.